What does shame do for Australians and the fragility of not being able to cope with issues that are challenging? Tanvir, welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be in show, Cheryl. Sounds like a great lineup and pleasure to be part of it.
Thank you very much. It's great to have you. Tanvir, you've got a very interesting life and congratulations on your publications. One of your publications, The Fragile Nation, talking about mental health and that the lens through which we view life through that and the issues associated with it, particularly when there is that encouragement almost through media and conversations to actually have a mental health problem. It's quite a difficult situation when you know that there are people with, and I don't like to say those that are genuine and those that are not, but we tend to see trends come and go, and your book on the Fragile Nation covers that, along with other terrific work that you've done, another book in defence of shame. But let's get back to fragility and mental health. What is mental health?
Yeah, look, that's a great place to start, Joe. I think we use the term so broadly. So I think now it's become such a broadly used label that it means different things to different people. I think there's a lay meaning of mental health, which has just become a synonym for our emotional lives. So that's quite a broad label. But immediately there's the fact that we increasingly call our emotional lives mental health already gives you a sense that we've potentially over-medicalised the day-to-day experience. So I think that's what the key way people use it now. Mental health just becomes a synonym for our emotional lives and the ups and downs and problems of living, essentially problems of living. In a more technical sense, mental health probably encompasses a few different fields. Like one is psychologists, and that's probably what most people are familiar with, and that's where their job at a technical level is to try and challenge thought patterns and alter behaviour. There's doctors, and we're trying to do bits of everything, but our most recognised role is potentially using medications to modify our emotional experience, including our bodily chemistry. So there's some of the technical meanings. And I guess historically what mental health is referred to is what we might have called psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory. And that's a very interesting part of mental health, but it's one that's probably on the outer now. And that's really this idea that we're primitive beings, we're instinctual beings. So much of what happens or how we behave, it happens under the surface. We're barely aware of it. And to some extent, what we call mental health is a challenge between our primitive selves and our social selves. So we have all these drives, whether it's aggression, sexuality, disgust, and try to manage that with this human invention we call society, where we have all sorts of demands and expectations and try to manage relationships and status. And it's a combination of those different disciplines that is the technical meaning of mental health. But there's obviously a lay meaning that's come to the fore.
It's quite interesting to hear that you've got these different elements, and with that I'm suspecting that there would be some conflict and perhaps logically some compromise as to how people view that when you're trying to work with individuals. You've mentioned, and I think your first summation there, mental health is really a synonym for emotional life, as in that's the way we are seeing it today. And of course that in essence is a social construct, just as society is. And there are certainly emotions that we all have. Which emotions would you say are, if I could be so bold, detrimental, and which ones are beneficial? I would think that we all experience all emotions at some point in our life, and it's more about management than naming or shaming.
Well, that's right. I think all the emotions are inevitable. They serve a purpose. They're adaptive. They're essentially what we call adaptive. They're a type of communication of your needs and what's going wrong or what the gaps are. I guess an interesting aspect of modern life is we part of that book, Fragile Motion, that I wrote is, part of the notion is that increasingly we, rather than us being involved in, say, the big things of public policy or the day-to-day political debates, which are still important, but most people are withdrawn from that. And the way they see their life is through managing their health, their emotional lives, and that's almost the way they seek some sort of salvation. Likewise, most people aren't religious. It's a more secular society. But they'll channel it a lot through this type of kind of lifestyle management, which includes the notion of mental health. It certainly includes physical health, including this term called wellness, which can have both sort of positive and negative connotations. So when we talk about our different emotions, I guess a change in modern life is that we monitor our emotions more intensely than ever. Historically, people would have varieties of emotions, but they weren't necessarily examined to the depth because we're far more social beings. We didn't necessarily place such an importance in our inner life in the way we do, say, in the last 150 years. And that, a big part of that is the field that I'm in, for better or worse. So even now, I see people coming in with their Apple Watches, and we ask them to do mood charts, and they're monitoring almost their moods at a minute by minute, hour by hour level, which in historical terms is, borders on like farcical. It's kind of ridiculous, and that's an example where it can go too far. But look, all the emotions are signals. Things like you mentioned, things like shame, but the guilt and shame, for example. They're called our self-conscious emotions, where you've got a real sense of, it's like you're seeing yourself within a group or in a moral framework. And then we have all our other various emotions. Pain is critical, tells us when we're in danger, we need to potentially avoid something. I guess the nature of emotions now, because we live in a very unusual environment biologically, so we have all these adaptive emotions, but then we live in these sort of urbanized modern environments. So that's where the emotion, when talking about problematic emotions, often emotions come out in unusual ways and they're made for a certain situation. So a classic example that I often deal with is, say, social anxiety or other types of anxiety where people get very fearful. And that's an example where we're evolved for a certain framework, essentially, the jungle, if you like. And then what might have been fearful there, potentially we're trying to avoid a predator, an animal like a tiger or a snake. Instead, in modern life, it becomes this horrific fear of, having a coffee or turning up at a group meeting or giving a presentation.
Sounds like we need to toughen up a little bit here, Tanvir, and that's a phrase that we've heard many a time, particularly for young boys. Come on, toughen up, be a man. And I don't believe it was in any way intended to be inappropriate, particularly the way it's viewed now as in conjunction with misogyny and all those other negative elements toward men. It really is essentially, life isn't that easy at times and you have to be strong and keep pushing through. And that's certainly a message that came from men who experienced war or the consequences of war from their fathers and so on and so forth over history. We've been fortunate to have many, many decades without Australia being heavily involved in war. Certainly there's been Afghanistan and other elements, and I don't discount that. It seems that we've had it too good for too long, and that has contributed perhaps to this inability to be strong and that we are a more fragile society.
Well, we're definitely in a very peaceful, prosperous, and very sanitised. So, compared to past generations, for example, most of us would not see a dead body, or there's all sorts of what we call trauma now would not be considered, would be considered fairly normal, in decades past or centuries past. But at the same time, on one level, yes, I'd love people to toughen up, but more I've thought about this, but the challenge is what's the sort of skills that are prized and the economy that we live in. It does appear that I think emotional skills are more important than ever. You think at the advent of AI, social media, the decline of physical manufacturing work, you refer to men of times past. I mean, historically, men could have done a physical job, come home, have something to eat. They might live, let's say 4 or 5 decades. But it was, on one level, there were extreme physical demands. Not that there weren't emotional demands, but arguably there wasn't the same level of emotional sophistication or things to manage, like all these different relationships, all these workplace things, and
roles were more defined, weren't they?
Exactly, and so many different types of people, and a decline in the importance of, say, manual labour or manufacturing. So there's a set of skills that has changed. So in some ways, our emotional, on one level, we can criticise, and I think it's right to scrutinise that the fact that we've elevated our emotional lives and the day-to-day monitoring of them. But it is partly a reflection of the life we live in. So it's hugely prosperous. It's a service economy. We live much longer, and life's purpose has shifted to fulfillment, self-fulfillment.
It's quite interesting, because when you look at other philosophers over the years, that self-fulfillment or human flourishing, we go right back to Aristotle with that. So it's nothing that's new there. The issue I see, and I wonder whether or not you agree, is that responsibility doesn't go with it, number one. More importantly, trust from government that we can be responsible citizens. And I link that very much to the family unit. You've rightly talked about the way in which society has changed. We haven't yet mentioned the family unit and the breakdown of families, and particularly here in Australia with the Family Law Act back in 1975 was an abhorrent disgrace, and we've got people trying to sort out who they are and how they raise children, and the media is constantly attacking parents, and it's very, very difficult, no doubt, and you'd be certainly seeing a lot of people with children, be them school age or young adults, even into adult life, going through horrendous issues, and that must have an impact on their fragility.
Well, that's at the heart of things, isn't it, Cheryl? Like you mentioned ADHD growth. I mean, yesterday NDIS was in the news. When you chip away, I mean, they sound like all these policy things. People are, it's great you're doing all this stuff for the disabled, but you chip away at it. And at the heart of it is often broken families, families struggling to raise kids, the scaffolding of extended families and community just no longer being able to kind of support human flourishing, as you've alluded to. When you chip away, that's at the heart of it. And on one level, it's very hard to go back to white picket fences, the 50s, and the kind of, the more traditional families, but trying to find a happy balance. And we're going through that now. We're having all these different debates, and many of the reactions that are going on in the world now are a protest to kind of excesses of the last few decades, where almost too much freedom, too much focus on human individual fulfillment, too much focus on what people want for their own flourishing at the expense of responsibility or commitment to other institutions, including family or church or whatever, or a vocation, whatever it might be. And look, people want the right balance of that, I think, and they're searching for that. But so many of the problems that end up in government's lap, certainly in Australia, where we really have a very parental type of government almost coming in to solve every problem.
That's a nice way to put that. Very nice way to put that.
I mean, that does take away agency. So
it does.
One of the things I'm interested in is a combination of the rise in mental health, where we get a diagnosis for everything. And that's driven... Look, there are lots of drivers for that. For example, funding is a key one. So,
sure.
Things like NDIS, lots of so people almost need a diagnosis to navigate the system.
Indeed, and you talk about funding. Just to wrap things up here, Bill Gates has announced his fragility. So he's been listening to you, Tanvi. His fragility agenda for 2045, and he's investing $200 billion towards fragility. And no surprises, his focus is mothers and children, disease and poverty. Now, these to me are the consequences and the fallout of the very things that we're talking about, and that is a solid family structure in the first instance, and respect for families and their extended networks. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. We've only got about a minute left, Tanvir. What would you say to Bill Gates if he was sitting where I am right now?
Well, look, I think his idea is a good one, and almost so many of the problems we have now are linked to early life and whether we can build good impulse-controlled character and social and emotional regulation. And I use that term character, which has a moral terminology, and we're losing a lot of that. Like, that's where a lot of the focus should be, and instead we get all these layers of government having to intrude so early in life because we get that part wrong, because we don't have stability, and instead we get fragility.
Indeed, and that's a great way to wrap that up, Tanvir. It's been terrific listening to you, and I will get back to you so that we can talk about shame a little bit more. We ran out of time today. And particularly one thing I do want to discuss with you is personality disorders. So let's keep in touch. There's a lot to learn from you, and thank you very much for being on the show, and congratulations again on all that you do to educate us on mental health. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. That was Tanvir Ahmed, author and media personality and psychiatrist, talking about mental health issues.